Power has always had a price. In some of the world's most remote islands and empires, brothers and sisters once became husbands and wives, not out of romance, but to hold on to something bigger: survival, sacred bloodlines, and absolute authority. To outsiders it sounds unthinkable, but to those who lived it, it was destiny. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because it's always amazing to see how stories like this travel across oceans and continents. Alright, let's get started. The first sailors who set their eyes on the scattered islands of the Pacific often wrote with astonishment. They described lands cut off by thousands of miles of ocean, where people had lived for centuries with little contact beyond their own shores. In such places, survival meant adapting not only to wind, tide, and soil, but also to the problem of how families and power were organized. What they discovered sometimes unsettled them. Among chiefs and kings in these islands, brothers and sisters could be husband and wife. On Hawaii, this practice had a name: piʻo. To those within the chiefly class, it was the most sacred of unions. A brother and sister of high rank might marry so that their children would inherit a bloodline untouched by lesser connections. The logic was not hidden. It was about keeping power pure, about concentrating divine authority in one family line. Outsiders, missionaries in particular, recoiled at the idea. But to the aliʻi, the ruling chiefs of Hawaii, it was a deliberate and necessary choice. A child born of such a marriage was not a scandal but a symbol of supreme legitimacy. Other great civilizations had taken similar paths. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh sometimes married his sister. In the Inca Empire, the emperor was expected to do the same. Each saw the sibling union as a way to seal royal blood and prevent it from being diluted. Persia recorded the same among its kings. Across these cultures, though separated by oceans and continents, the reasoning repeated itself. When the survival of a dynasty depended on the control of bloodlines, the line between brother and husband, sister and wife, could be crossed. Most people in these societies did not marry their siblings. These unions belonged almost entirely to kings and queens, men and women who carried sacred or divine status. Among the common families who planted taro in Hawaii or tended maize in the Andes, ordinary prohibitions held sway. But at the highest level, where legitimacy meant everything, the rules could bend. On islands where isolation left power structures fragile, the temptation to concentrate authority within one circle grew even stronger. Observers from abroad tried to fit these practices into familiar categories. Some called them corruption, others degeneration. But the patterns of kinship revealed a different story. In Hawaii, the bonds of siblings were central even outside of royal marriage. Families often operated in groups where brothers and sisters shared responsibilities more deeply than husbands and wives. A woman's brother could matter more to her household than her spouse. In South India, far from the Pacific, the Nayar community followed a similar pattern. Descent passed through the mother's line, and brothers, not husbands, were the anchors of the household. In such systems, the sibling bond was already the strongest tie. Turning that bond into marriage for reasons of power was not as unthinkable within the culture as it seemed to foreign eyes. The decline of these traditions came quickly once missionaries and colonial authorities arrived. In Hawaii, Christian leaders condemned the practice, calling it sinful and unlawful. By the mid-19th century, sibling marriage among the chiefs had ended. What had once been celebrated as the highest form of chiefly union became a remembered practice, preserved in stories and genealogies but no longer lived. Outsiders judged, laws changed, and the sacred was recast as taboo. Even so, these histories remain a reminder of how differently communities have solved the problem of lineage and legitimacy. Some cultures saw incest as the worst violation, a threat to the community's survival. In Madagascar, when separated siblings accidentally came together, the community believed that the land itself would rebel. Harvests would fail, illnesses would spread, misfortunes would multiply, until rituals restored balance. For others, like the royal houses of Hawaii or Egypt, a brother and sister together meant continuity, not disaster. The same act carried opposite meanings depending on where one stood. For the sailors who wrote in their journals, and the missionaries who preached against what they saw, it was difficult to comprehend. Yet, for those born within the system, it made perfect sense. On islands where the ocean shut out the rest of the world, families built rules of their own. Brothers and sisters became husbands and wives not because the people lacked morality, but because their ideas of sacredness, kinship, and power drew the boundaries differently. What seemed forbidden elsewhere could be essential here. When people first settled the far-flung islands of the Pacific, survival came before every other concern. Small groups of voyagers, often no more than a few extended families, landed on shores that were fertile but isolated. Their numbers were limited, and their ties to one another became the foundation of their societies. In such a setting, kinship rules developed not only to regulate marriage but also to ensure the survival of the group. The lines of who could marry whom were drawn and redrawn according to the pressures of geography, population, and politics. On Hawaii, the earliest communities relied heavily on extended families working together. Chiefs, or aliʻi, organized labor for irrigation, fishing, and cultivation of taro. Authority rested on descent, and the purity of lineage mattered from the beginning. In a world with no outside kingdoms to forge alliances with, power had to be reinforced internally. A ruling family might look to siblings, cousins, or other close kin to form unions that would secure its position. Over time, this principle became formalized, particularly among the highest-ranking chiefs, where brother-sister marriages ensured that sacred rank would not be diluted by alliances with lesser families. The environment reinforced this need. Isolated islands had finite land and limited populations. Royalty could not easily expand their legitimacy through wide-reaching alliances, as kings in Europe might do. Instead, they turned inward. By marrying within the family, they concentrated power, ensuring that political authority remained tied to bloodlines already recognized as sacred. The logic was pragmatic, though it carried profound cultural meaning. In small island societies, kinship was not just a matter of personal union but of survival for the entire political system. European records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries often describe their shock at encountering these customs. Captain James Cook and later missionaries noted the close ties within chiefly families. For the foreigners, these unions seemed unnatural. For Hawaiians, however, they were an expression of the sacred order. A child born of a brother-sister union among the highest chiefs carried the strongest claim to rule. The belief was that such a child embodied a concentration of mana, the spiritual power that justified authority. This was not mere preference. It was considered essential to the legitimacy of leadership. The pattern of sibling marriage was not unique to Hawaii. In the Andes, Inca rulers practiced a similar tradition. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was expected to marry his sister, often called the Koya. Their union symbolized the unity of sun and moon, divine brother and sister, whose children would inherit unquestioned authority. Here too, the isolation of geography, the high mountains, the distance from other powerful states, reinforced the practice. The ruling family could not afford to weaken its authority through diluted alliances. Isolation created different outcomes depending on context. Among ordinary island families, incest prohibitions remained strong. Brothers and sisters in common households did not marry, and such unions would have been condemned. The difference lay in status. For royalty, maintaining the purity of bloodline justified what would otherwise be forbidden. In the eyes of the common people, these marriages carried symbolic meaning. They represented not corruption but the sacredness of those who ruled over them. Missionary accounts from the 19th century reveal how this system came under attack. In Hawaii, Christian leaders condemned sibling unions as immoral. Laws were gradually introduced that banned marriages between close relatives, and over time, even the chiefs abandoned the practice. By the mid-19th century, the tradition had ended. Yet the genealogies and oral histories preserved the memory, showing how deeply woven it had been into the society's structure. The story of sibling marriage on isolated islands is therefore a story of adaptation. Faced with limited numbers, the need for political authority, and the absence of external partners, ruling families turned inward. What to outsiders seemed a violation was, within those societies, a tool of survival and a symbol of sacred power. These unions were not the product of ignorance or indulgence, but of deliberate choice shaped by the constraints of geography and the demands of leadership. The outsiders who came to these islands often failed to understand that point. They judged through the lens of their own traditions, where such unions had long been taboo. For the islanders themselves, the rules were different, drawn from their environment and their worldview. It was only after colonization and the spread of foreign religions that the practice disappeared, leaving behind stories that still challenge assumptions about what is natural or universal in human kinship. The system of kinship on isolated islands was not a simple backdrop to everyday life. It was the framework that determined who held authority, who inherited land, who was considered sacred, and who was considered ordinary. In communities where brothers and sisters could become husbands and wives, kinship rules were both complex and deliberate. Understanding how these systems functioned requires not only examining the rare cases of sibling unions themselves, but also the wider network of obligations, beliefs, and practices that made such arrangements possible and even necessary. In Hawaii, kinship was described in terms far more intricate than the categories familiar to Europeans. Genealogies were remembered with precision, often extending back generations. These genealogies were not only records of ancestry but also maps of power. A person's standing in society depended on how closely their bloodline was connected to sacred ancestors. The most powerful chiefs claimed descent from gods, and the purity of that descent determined their right to rule. To preserve such purity, marriage between brother and sister at the highest chiefly level was regarded as the ideal. Children of these unions were considered niopio, the most sacred of all lineages, and their authority could not be questioned. For ordinary families, however, the rules were different. Incest was forbidden, and kinship obligations maintained strict boundaries. Brothers and sisters played important roles in one another's lives, but they were not partners. The brother was often the protector of his sister's children, particularly in matrilineal contexts where descent passed through the mother's line. This system created a strong tie between siblings, but it also reinforced the distinction between common families and ruling families. What was reserved as a sacred exception for chiefs remained a taboo for commoners. The contrast between elite and ordinary practices can be seen across many cultures. In Egypt, sibling marriage was also largely confined to royalty, though some evidence suggests that it spread more widely during certain periods. The Inca restricted it firmly to the emperor and his sister, reinforcing the idea that divine authority could not be diluted by outside blood. This pattern repeated itself. The practice was almost never common, but it carried profound meaning where it was permitted. It elevated the ruling family above all others, setting them apart not only politically but spiritually. Anthropologists who studied kinship systems noticed that the brother-sister relationship was often central even outside of marriage. In matrilineal societies, the brother could wield more authority over his sister's children than the children's own father. Among the Nayar of South India, husbands were visitors, while brothers formed the stable foundation of the household. In certain Pacific Island groups, similar structures appeared. These systems did not always lead to sibling marriage, but they did establish the sibling bond as the core of social life. When power, land, or sacredness had to be preserved, it was natural to look to that bond as the one strong enough to carry it. European observers who encountered these practices often wrote about them in tones of shock or disapproval, but their records remain valuable. Missionaries in Hawaii described the unions of chiefs in detail, not to admire them, but to condemn them. Colonial administrators recorded similar practices elsewhere, sometimes as curiosities, sometimes as proof of what they considered the moral failings of non-European societies. Despite their judgments, these documents provide evidence of the deliberate and structured way in which sibling unions were embedded in local systems. Genetic and demographic realities also played a role. Small populations face challenges of maintaining diversity while also preserving authority. In most cases, strict prohibitions against incest are maintained to avoid these dangers, but when survival of a ruling line is placed above genetic risk, exceptions appear. The rarity of such unions, even in small communities, shows that they were never taken lightly. They were not the norm, but rather extraordinary choices made for extraordinary reasons. The decline of sibling marriage in these contexts came with outside pressure. In Hawaii, the influence of missionaries was decisive. They brought with them a worldview in which incest was one of the gravest sins, both morally and legally. Chiefs who had once entered sibling unions to reinforce their authority now faced a choice: cling to traditions that outsiders condemned, or adapt to the new order that came with guns, trade, and the promise of international recognition. Over time, adaptation won. The practice faded, leaving behind oral traditions and genealogical records that told of a time when brothers and sisters could be husband and wife, but only within the sacred circle of the elite. To view these unions as aberrations is to miss their significance. They were symbols of a worldview in which the sibling bond was the strongest tie, and the preservation of lineage was the highest duty. They remind us that kinship is not a fixed or universal system, but one shaped by environment, history, and belief. On isolated islands, cut off from the rest of the world, people built rules of their own. The line between brother and husband, sister and wife, was drawn differently, not from ignorance or immorality, but from a deliberate logic of survival and sanctity. This logic can be unsettling to those who view kinship through other lenses. Yet it reflects the diversity of human societies and the adaptability of family systems. What one culture regards as forbidden, another may see as essential. In the end, the story of sibling marriage on these islands is less about scandal than it is about survival, power, and the many ways humans have sought to order their lives in the face of isolation. When outsiders first arrived on the islands where sibling unions existed, their reactions were immediate and often severe. The practice stood in stark contrast to the moral codes they carried with them, shaped by centuries of European religious doctrine. What the islanders regarded as sacred, the newcomers branded as sin. This clash of worldviews would prove decisive in reshaping local customs, as missionaries, traders, and colonial governments pressed their authority upon communities that had long lived according to their own rules. The earliest European accounts of sibling marriage in Hawaii came from explorers and their crews. Sailors who encountered the royal families described the unions with fascination but also with a sense of scandal. To them, the idea that a king might marry his own sister violated natural order. Yet, even as they recorded their disapproval, they noted that within Hawaiian society such unions were considered honorable, and the children born from them were destined for the highest positions. These observations, filtered through the eyes of outsiders, were among the first written records to bring the practice to the attention of the wider world. Missionaries who followed soon after brought a different tone. For them, it was not enough to describe. They sought to change. In the early 19th century, Christian missions in Hawaii quickly identified sibling marriage among the chiefs as one of the greatest obstacles to conversion. They preached against it in sermons, labeling it an abomination, and urged the ruling families to abandon it. Their goal was not only spiritual but also political. By reshaping family life, they believed they could reshape society itself. Marriage, as they understood it, was the cornerstone of Christian civilization, and it could not be allowed to exist in a form they regarded as corrupt. Colonial administrators, too, played their part. As foreign powers extended their influence, laws were introduced that banned marriages between close relatives. These legal codes reflected European norms and left little room for exceptions. Chiefs who had once married their sisters in order to strengthen their sacred rank were now faced with official prohibition. To defy the law meant to risk political isolation and loss of favor with the new powers that control trade and recognition. Over time, compliance became the path of least resistance, and the once sacred unions disappeared from public life. The effect of these pressures on local communities was profound. For the chiefly class, abandoning sibling unions meant relinquishing a key element of their traditional authority. The sacred children of piʻo marriages, once seen as embodiments of supreme legitimacy, were no longer possible. This shift weakened the old structures of rank and hierarchy. New forms of status emerged, tied less to sacred bloodlines and more to wealth, education, and alliances with foreign powers. The transformation of marriage was part of a larger process in which the old order was dismantled and replaced by a new one shaped by colonization. For ordinary families, the change reinforced prohibitions that had always existed. Commoners had never practiced sibling marriage, and in many cases they may have welcomed the alignment of law with their own customs. Yet the sense of awe and respect for chiefly unions also faded. Where once a brother-sister marriage among royals symbolized divine legitimacy, it now came to be remembered with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. The community's perception shifted in line with the new moral codes introduced by missionaries and enforced by law. Eyewitness accounts from this period reveal the tension. Some describe chiefs who struggled with the new expectations, torn between tradition and the demands of the colonial order. Others recounted how missionaries celebrated the end of sibling unions as evidence of moral progress. In their writings, the missionaries often portrayed themselves as saviors, rescuing islanders from what they considered corruption. Yet to those within the culture, the change represented the loss of a deeply held belief in the sacredness of certain bloodlines. The difference in interpretation could not have been greater. The reactions of outsiders extended beyond the islands themselves. In Europe and America, reports of sibling marriage among Hawaiians and other societies were circulated as evidence of the strangeness of distant peoples. These reports were used to justify colonial control, reinforcing the idea that such communities required the guidance of civilized powers. The practice of sibling marriage, though limited and sacred in its own context, was stripped of its meaning and presented as proof of backwardness. This misrepresentation contributed to the erosion of respect for indigenous traditions and accelerated the imposition of foreign norms. At the same time, the fascination did not disappear. Scholars and anthropologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries examined the records of sibling unions with intense interest. Some sought to understand them in their cultural context, noting the parallels with Egypt, the Inca, and Persia. Others treated them as anomalies, curiosities that confirmed their theories about the evolution of human society. The practice was dissected in academic texts, sometimes with respect, sometimes with disdain, but always through the lens of outsiders. Rarely were the voices of the islanders themselves preserved in these accounts. The tension between internal meaning and external judgment highlights the complexity of this phase of history. Within the islands, sibling marriage among chiefs was not an act of scandal but of sanctity, a deliberate choice that carried profound political and spiritual weight. To outsiders, it was the opposite, a violation of natural law, a sign of corruption, or at best a curiosity. The clash between these interpretations reshaped the societies where the practice once existed, erasing traditions that had been central to the organization of power and replacing them with systems aligned with foreign values. By the end of the 19th century, the practice had all but vanished. Missionary influence, colonial law, and the changing needs of society combined to extinguish sibling unions. Yet the memory remained. Genealogies recorded them, oral traditions recounted them, and historians and anthropologists continued to analyze them. What once was a living institution became a subject of study and debate, preserved in memory but no longer practiced. The voices of those who had once seen such unions as sacred were largely lost, drowned out by the louder voices of those who condemned them. The story of how outsiders reacted to sibling marriage on these islands is not only a story of disapproval but also of transformation. It shows how cultural encounters can reshape the deepest structures of society, altering not only marriage but the very foundations of authority and legitimacy. It also reminds us that what seems natural or moral in one context can be seen as strange or wrong in another, and that the judgment of outsiders can carry lasting consequences. The consequences of sibling unions on isolated islands cannot be understood without examining their medical, genetic, and demographic dimensions. Although the practice was limited, primarily to ruling families rather than the broader population, it still carried biological implications, as well as cultural strategies to mitigate risk. To write the story of these unions fully, one must trace not only their symbolic meaning but also their impact on health, survival, and the population as a whole. The first question outsiders often asked when hearing of brothers and sisters marrying was whether this led to illness or weakness in the children. European travelers, familiar with their own medical theories, assumed that such unions would inevitably result in degeneration. The word incest in their writings was tied to ideas of deformity, disease, and collapse. Yet the evidence from island societies complicates this assumption. Records show that many of the children born of chiefly sibling unions in Hawaii grew to adulthood, held power, and were remembered in genealogies without mention of abnormality. The sacred children of piʻo marriages were not described as weak but as strong, legitimate, and in possession of extraordinary authority. Part of the explanation lies in the scale of the practice. Sibling marriage was never widespread among the general population. It was confined to a small elite, often with only a handful of such unions in a generation. This limited scope reduced the long-term genetic risks that would have been expected if the entire community practiced it regularly. In effect, the population as a whole maintained genetic diversity, while the chiefly families concentrated their bloodlines only in specific cases. Even so, the risks were real. Modern genetics confirms that close inbreeding can increase the likelihood of harmful recessive traits appearing. A child of a sibling union is far more likely to inherit identical copies of a defective gene than a child of unrelated parents. Historical studies of other royal families provide evidence of these consequences. In Egypt, for instance, some mummies of royal individuals show signs of congenital deformities. In European dynasties, where cousin marriages were common, hemophilia and other disorders spread through noble bloodlines. The Hawaiian case, while less extensively studied at the genetic level, likely carried similar risks, even if they were not always visible or recorded in oral histories. Demography also shaped the significance of these unions. Island populations were often small and vulnerable. Epidemics introduced by outsiders could devastate them, reducing numbers dramatically. In such fragile settings, the survival of a ruling line was symbolically more urgent than the long-term risks of genetic weakness. Chiefs were focused on preserving legitimacy in the present, not on managing unseen genetic hazards that would only be understood centuries later. For them, the danger of losing authority outweighed the potential risk to offspring. The missionaries and colonial officials who condemned sibling unions often framed their opposition partly in medical terms. They argued that such practices led to disease and degeneration. In their sermons and reports, they presented themselves not only as moral guardians but also as protectors of health. Yet their claims were shaped more by European assumptions than by careful observation of local outcomes. Their writings reveal more about the moral frameworks of the time than about the actual biological consequences on the islands. Anthropologists who studied kinship systems added another layer to the picture. They noted that incest taboos in most societies were tied not only to biology but also to social order. The danger of siblings marrying was as much about disrupting alliances and weakening networks as it was about producing unhealthy offspring. By keeping siblings apart, communities ensured that marriages created new ties between families, strengthening cooperation and expanding support systems. Where sibling marriage was allowed, as in the case of chiefs, the social meaning outweighed these considerations. The union did not serve to build alliances outward but to reinforce authority inward. It was a different kind of logic, one that prioritized sacred concentration over broad connection. In medical terms, the consequences of such unions would have depended heavily on the wider context. A single generation of sibling marriage does not inevitably produce illness. It is repeated close unions over multiple generations that heighten risks dramatically. In Hawaii and the Inca Empire, where sibling unions occurred at the highest level but not consistently generation after generation, the dangers may have been less pronounced than outsiders imagined. This does not mean there were no effects, but it helps explain why these societies could sustain the practice for centuries without apparent collapse. Demographically, the practice also reinforced population hierarchies. By setting the ruling class apart through sacred unions, it maintained clear divisions between chiefs and commoners. The chiefly families concentrated both power and risk within their own lines. Commoners, by following ordinary prohibitions, preserved the genetic diversity of the larger population. This division of practice meant that the society as a whole remained resilient, even as the ruling class took on risks that were justified by their sacred role. The arrival of Europeans introduced new medical pressures that overshadowed any genetic concerns. Diseases such as measles, smallpox, and influenza swept through the islands, killing vast numbers regardless of lineage. These epidemics devastated populations so quickly and completely that the slower, subtler risks of inbreeding became almost irrelevant in comparison. Chiefs and commoners alike were struck down by illnesses for which they had no immunity. In the face of such crises, the survival of the ruling line became even more precarious. The old strategy of sibling unions could not protect them from the far greater biological threat that arrived with ships. Over time, as modern medicine and anthropology developed, scholars revisited the question of sibling unions with new tools. Geneticists looked for evidence of hereditary disorders in royal lines, while anthropologists analyzed the social and demographic logic of the practice. These studies revealed the complexity of the issue. Sibling marriage was not a careless disregard for health, but a deliberate choice made under specific circumstances. The people who practiced it did not ignore the risks. Rather, they lived in worlds where other dangers, loss of authority, social collapse, or outside conquest, seemed far more pressing. The legacy of these unions remains in genealogical records and in the memory of communities. Descendants of chiefly lines can trace their ancestry back to piʻo marriages, and their family stories carry the weight of both pride and controversy. Scholars continue to debate the balance between the symbolic power gained and the genetic risks taken. The debate itself reflects the enduring fascination with how humans, across time and space, have managed the intersection of biology, culture, and survival. Among the people who lived on islands where sibling unions were permitted at the highest level, explanations of the practice were rooted in stories, rituals, and traditions that outsiders often misunderstood. Oral tradition carried meaning across generations, telling why a brother might be joined to his sister, not in shame but in reverence. These explanations were not framed in the language of genetics or law, but in the language of mana, ancestry, and sacred balance. In Hawaii, oral histories describe the power of chiefly bloodlines in terms of their closeness to the gods. Chiefs who traced descent from the Sky Father Wakea and the Earth Mother Papahānaumoku were seen as direct embodiments of divine union. Their offspring carried a spark of that original joining of sky and earth. In this way, the idea that siblings of the highest rank could marry was not simply a matter of politics. It was a continuation of divine precedent. To refuse such a union would be to deny the sacred origin of the world itself. Children born of these unions were said to embody the concentrated essence of sacredness, their genealogy linking them more closely than anyone else to the divine parents of creation. These traditions were not written down in books until outsiders arrived. Instead, they were remembered in chants, songs, and genealogies recited by skilled specialists. Genealogical recitations were more than lists of names. They were proof of legitimacy, a demonstration of how one family line connected back to the gods. Within these chants, the joining of siblings among the aliʻi was recorded without hesitation. The genealogies made clear that such unions created leaders whose right to rule could not be challenged. Among the Inca, similar traditions explained why the Sapa Inca was expected to marry his sister, the Koya. The Inca traced their origins to the sun god Inti and his sister, the moon goddess Mama Quilla. Their children were the founders of the Inca people. For the emperor and his sister to marry was to mirror the divine pattern, embodying in human form the union of sun and moon. Rituals surrounding the royal couple emphasized this connection. Festivals honored them as earthly representations of celestial beings. Through these traditions, sibling marriage became not only permissible but essential. The meaning of family in these contexts was therefore very different from the meanings carried by Europeans. To European missionaries, marriage was a covenant between two unrelated individuals, blessed by the church and bound by law. To island societies and Andean rulers, marriage was an act that carried spiritual weight because of who the partners were in relation to one another. Siblings joined in marriage were not breaking a law. They were fulfilling a divine pattern. Traditions also placed responsibility on siblings in ways unfamiliar to outsiders. In matrilineal systems, a man's primary duty was not to his wife and children but to his sister and her children. His role as uncle was central, his authority over his sister's household greater than that of the children's father. This orientation shaped how people understood the family unit. The brother-sister relationship carried the greatest weight, and in some societies it was natural to elevate it further. Even if sibling marriage was not widely practiced, the bond itself was celebrated as the foundation of kinship. Rituals reinforced these ideas. Ceremonies surrounding chiefly unions were filled with symbolism of balance, sacredness, and continuity. Offerings were made to ancestral spirits, Chants proclaimed the divine origins of the couple, and communities were reminded that their leaders carried the blood of the gods. Outsiders who observed such ceremonies without context saw only what they regarded as transgression. But for those within the culture, the rituals confirmed the order of the world. Tradition also carried warnings. In Madagascar, where incest was strongly taboo, oral accounts described the disastrous consequences of violating the boundary. Crops might fail, illness might spread, or misfortune might strike until rituals of cleansing were performed. These stories did not involve sibling marriage as a sacred practice but showed the power attributed to kinship rules. They demonstrated how communities saw incest not as a private matter but as a threat to the collective well-being. The sharp contrast with Hawaiian or Incan traditions reveals how oral tradition could sanctify or condemn the same act depending on the cultural logic. Over time, as missionary influence spread and colonial laws took hold, these traditions began to shift. Chants that once praised piʻo unions in Hawaii were no longer performed openly. Rituals that had once affirmed the sacredness of siblings as spouses gave way to Christian weddings. Oral traditions did not disappear, but they were reframed, sometimes whispered in families, sometimes preserved only in written records transcribed by outsiders. The sacred explanations were gradually pushed aside by moral condemnations. Yet the memory remained. Even today, fragments of these traditions survive. Genealogies preserved in writing still record unions of brother and sister chiefs, and chants continue to be studied by cultural practitioners who seek to understand their meaning. The stories of the Inca continue to be told, with the sun and moon remembered as divine siblings whose union gave birth to a people. These traditions stand as testimony to the fact that family, marriage, and sacredness were once understood in ways that do not align with modern expectations. The oral traditions do not apologize for the practice. They present it as a fact of sacred history, a continuation of divine origin stories, and a foundation for political authority. They show that in the eyes of those who lived within these systems, sibling unions were not aberrations but affirmations of the deepest truths of their world. When the age of colonization spread across oceans, island societies and their traditions of kinship were not left untouched. Colonization was not only a political project, it was also a moral campaign. European powers carried with them laws, doctrines, and assumptions about family that clashed directly with local customs. In the case of sibling unions among chiefs and royals, colonization became the decisive force that transformed them from sacred practices into forbidden memories. The Hawaiian Islands provide a clear example. By the early 19th century, Christian missionaries had arrived from New England, backed by trading networks and supported by foreign governments. They began by preaching the gospel, but their work quickly extended into reshaping social institutions. Marriage was one of their central targets. To the missionaries, the Hawaiian chiefly unions between brothers and sisters were not sacred but sinful. Their journals and letters are filled with condemnation, describing these marriages as abominations that must be eradicated for true conversion to occur. The ruling chiefs faced unprecedented pressure. Their legitimacy had long rested on genealogical purity, and sibling marriage was part of that structure. Yet their authority also depended on maintaining alliances with foreigners, who brought not only religion but weapons, ships, and trade. Chiefs who continued the old practice risked alienating these powerful newcomers. Over time, the balance shifted. Chiefs began to abandon sibling unions, adopting Christian marriage in order to align themselves with the rising colonial order. Colonial law followed quickly. As foreign governments gained influence in the islands, they imposed legal codes based on European models. These codes prohibited marriage between close kin, leaving no space for cultural exceptions. Once enforced by law, sibling unions could no longer be performed openly, even by those who still believed in their sacred meaning. Within a generation, what had once been honored as the highest form of union became a crime under the new legal system. A similar transformation occurred in the Andes. After the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire in the 16th century, royal sibling marriage was among the first traditions to be targeted. The Spaniards, guided by Catholic doctrine, refused to recognize marriages between brothers and sisters, even when they involved the Sapa Inca and his sister wife. They declared such unions invalid, erasing the legitimacy they once carried. In their chronicles, Spanish writers described the practice as evidence of Inca barbarity, using it to justify conquest and religious conversion. The marriage of the emperor to his sister was recast as proof of pagan corruption, not divine authority. The political consequences were profound. By stripping legitimacy from sibling unions, colonizers undermined the very foundation of indigenous rule. In Hawaii, chiefs were forced to find new bases for authority, often by aligning with missionary institutions and foreign legal systems. In the Andes, the Inca dynasty itself collapsed, its sacred claims dismantled by Spanish reinterpretation of kinship. Colonization thus transformed sibling marriage from a pillar of power into a tool for discrediting native rulers. Beyond law and politics, colonization also reshaped memory. In missionary schools, children were taught that the old practices of their ancestors were sinful. Oral traditions that once praised piʻo unions were discouraged or silenced. Over time, communities began to internalize the colonial perspective, treating sibling marriage not as sacred history but as something shameful, best left unspoken. The shift was not only external. It reached into the hearts of the people themselves, altering how they remembered their own past. This transformation was reinforced by global circulation of ideas. Reports of sibling unions in Hawaii and the Inca Empire appeared in European books and newspapers, where they were presented as curiosities or scandals. These reports shaped public opinion abroad, feeding the image of island societies as strange and in need of civilizing. Colonization did not simply impose new rules locally. It also placed these societies within a broader narrative of European superiority, using their kinship practices as evidence of their supposed inferiority. Colonial archives preserve the voices of officials and missionaries who pushed this transformation. Their writings describe laws being passed, marriages being annulled, and customs being abolished. But the voices of those who lived through the change are harder to hear. Chiefs who gave up sibling unions left little record of their private struggles. Commoners who watched the transformation of their rulers could only witness in silence. The imbalance of sources means that much of what we know comes through the filter of colonizers, who celebrated the eradication of practices they never sought to understand. Even so, traces of resistance remain. Some oral traditions continued to speak of sacred unions, preserving the older meaning even as public life conformed to new rules. In family genealogies, the unions were still recorded, showing that they had happened, even if their sacredness was no longer proclaimed. These traces reveal that colonization did not fully erase memory. It overlaid it with new interpretations, but beneath the surface, the old logic endured in whispers and records. Colonization also shifted the balance between sacred bloodlines and economic power. In the pre-colonial era, authority rested heavily on genealogy and divine legitimacy. After colonization, wealth, education, and alignment with foreign systems became more important. Chiefs could no longer rely on the sacred children of sibling unions to establish their supremacy. Instead, they sought legitimacy through Christian marriage, Western-style education, and connections with global trade. This reorientation changed the very fabric of leadership, replacing one logic of power with another. The legacy of colonization, therefore, was not only the end of sibling unions but the reshaping of cultural memory itself. What had once been celebrated in chants and rituals was reclassified as shameful or exotic. Generations grew up learning only the colonial interpretation, while the deeper meaning of sacred kinship was forgotten or ignored. Colonization thus succeeded not only in banning a practice but in transforming how it was remembered, replacing reverence with silence. The first wave of written records came from European observers themselves. Sailors, missionaries, and colonial officials wrote about what they saw with their own biases, but their documents now serve as crucial historical evidence. In Hawaii, journals from Captain James Cook's voyages described the exalted status of aliʻi chiefs and the concentration of bloodlines. Later missionary letters explicitly condemned sibling marriages among chiefs, but they also preserved the names of individuals who entered such unions. Without these writings, many specific details might have been lost. Yet these records were selective. They framed the practice as either a curiosity or a sin, not as a sacred custom. Parallel documentation occurred in the Andes. Spanish chroniclers such as Pedro Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega described the marriage of the Sapa Inca to his sister. Garcilaso, himself of mixed Inca and Spanish heritage, provided one of the most detailed accounts, explaining that such unions were not aberrations but requirements of legitimacy. His writings attempted to preserve Inca traditions in a sympathetic light, though always filtered through his own hybrid identity. For later historians, his testimony became a key window into understanding how the Incas themselves viewed the union of brother and sister at the highest level. Oral tradition, however, carried a different kind of memory. In Hawaii, chants such as the Mele Inoa name chants and aliʻi genealogical were recited to honor chiefly lines. These chants, preserved through performance, recorded sibling unions not as scandal but as fact, woven into the unbroken line of ancestry. The emphasis was not on morality but on legitimacy, on demonstrating that a chief was the sacred product of sacred unions. Although many of these chants were later transcribed by Hawaiian scholars working with missionaries or ethnographers, their origins lie in an oral world where memory was alive, not confined to the page. In the 20th century, anthropologists turned renewed attention to these traditions. Scholars like E.S. Craighill-Handy and Martha Beckwith studied Hawaiian chants and genealogies, documenting the place of piʻo unions. Anthropologists working in Peru examined Inca royal customs, comparing them with other cultures where sibling marriage occurred, such as ancient Egypt. These academic studies reframed the practice, seeking to explain it within cross-cultural theories of kinship, legitimacy, and political structure. For the first time, sibling unions were analyzed not only as curiosities but as systematic institutions serving specific social purposes. Genealogical work added yet another layer. Hawaiian genealogists, Kakau Mulalo, continued to preserve family histories, often in partnership with native scholars like David Malo and Samuel Kamakau. Their writings in the 19th century recorded the genealogies of aliʻi families, including marriages between siblings. Although writing under missionary influence, they still preserved the factual record, ensuring that the memory of these unions did not disappear entirely. Kamakau, in particular, provided detailed accounts of the political and sacred rationale behind chiefly sibling marriages, presenting them in the context of Hawaiian cosmology. The recording of these unions also extended into colonial legal archives. Court records, baptismal registers, and early censuses sometimes noted relationships between siblings among the elite, especially when disputes arose about legitimacy. These records were not created to honor tradition but to regulate society under colonial norms. Still, they inadvertently preserved fragments of evidence that later historians could piece together. Memory was not uniform. Within native communities, silence often surrounded the subject after colonization. Families who traced descent from sibling unions might acknowledge the fact privately but avoided speaking of it publicly, given the moral condemnation attached to the practice. The transformation of memory was thus twofold. Outsiders remembered sibling unions in order to condemn or study them, while insiders remembered quietly, often with ambivalence, balancing pride in chiefly descent with discomfort imposed by colonial morality. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new shifts in how sibling unions were remembered. In academic circles, the subject became part of comparative kinship studies, placed alongside discussions of cousin marriage in Europe, royal marriages in Egypt, and small population strategies in anthropology. Scholars moved beyond moral judgment, examining instead how these unions functioned in their cultural contexts. In Hawaiian cultural revival movements, chants and genealogies that mentioned piʻo marriages were studied again, this time with an emphasis on cultural pride rather than shame. Practitioners emphasized that these unions had a sacred logic, even if they were no longer practiced. In Peru, the Inca example became part of a broader national heritage. School children learned of the Sapa Inca and his sister wife as part of history, though usually framed through the lens of Spanish chroniclers. Over time, the practice was remembered less as a scandal and more as a marker of the uniqueness of Inca civilization. Archaeological work on royal mummies and DNA analysis added scientific data to the record, revealing patterns of kinship that aligned with historical accounts. In this way, memory merged with science, reinforcing what oral tradition and chronicles had long said. Today, the memory of sibling unions exists in multiple forms. In archives, it exists as missionary condemnation. In oral traditions, it persists as chants of legitimacy. In academic texts, it is studied as a cross-cultural institution. And in cultural revival movements, it is reconsidered as part of indigenous heritage, stripped of colonial shame. The practice no longer survives in lived form, but the memory remains layered, complex, and contested. As the 20th century advanced and colonial administrations gave way to independent governments, the memory of sibling unions among island and highland societies did not disappear. It was reframed in light of modern cultural identity. Independence movements, national histories, and indigenous revitalization projects all confronted the question of how to handle practices that had been silenced under colonial rule. The unions between brothers and sisters, once exalted as sacred and then condemned as sinful, became subjects of careful negotiation in the construction of cultural identity. In Hawaii, the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1970s reignited interest in traditional chants, genealogies, and cultural practices. Scholars, activists, and cultural practitioners worked to reclaim indigenous knowledge that had been marginalized for over a century. Genealogical chants that recorded chiefly sibling unions were revisited not as sources of scandal but as evidence of the sacred power of aliʻi lines. Within this revival, the practice of piʻo marriages was not proposed for reintroduction. No one argued for restoring sibling marriage itself, but it was acknowledged as part of Hawaiian history and as an expression of how power and sacredness had once been conceptualized. Chants were studied for their poetic structure and historical content, not censored for their references to kinship unions. In classrooms and cultural workshops, young Hawaiians learned that their ancestors had different ways of defining sacredness, even if those ways no longer shaped daily life. In Peru, the rise of indigenous movements in the 20th century brought renewed attention to the Inca past. The image of the Sapa Inca and his sister wife was incorporated into national narratives that celebrated pre-Columbian heritage. Festivals in Cusco and other Andean cities reenacted aspects of Inca ritual, with actors portraying the royal couple as embodiments of the sun and moon. While these reenactments did not emphasize the sibling relationship, they implicitly referenced it by presenting the emperor and queen as inseparable and divinely paired. For many Peruvians, the royal sibling marriage came to symbolize not scandal, but a cultural logic distinct from European norms, evidence of the uniqueness of Andean civilization. In both Hawaii and Peru, the question of how to remember sibling unions was tied to broader struggles for recognition. For Hawaiian activists, asserting the legitimacy of their own genealogical traditions, even those that included piʻo marriages, was a way of resisting colonial narratives that had branded their culture as barbaric. For Andean communities, reclaiming the sacred marriage of the Sapa Inca and his sister was a means of celebrating indigenous strength in the face of centuries of Spanish domination. The practice, once erased by colonial law, was recast as part of a proud cultural heritage. At the same time, these revivals required careful framing. Leaders of cultural movements often emphasized that the practice was part of the past, not something to be revived in daily life. They highlighted its symbolic meaning rather than its literal form. In Hawaiian cultural education, instructors explained that sibling marriage was a chiefly practice rooted in cosmology, not a general custom for the population. In Peru, teachers described it as an expression of divine legitimacy rather than a model for modern family life. By making this distinction, cultural practitioners could honor their ancestors without clashing directly with contemporary moral frameworks. Academic research during this period added new tools for understanding. Advances in genetics allowed scientists to study ancient remains, comparing DNA evidence with historical accounts. In Egypt, mummies confirmed the prevalence of royal sibling marriages. In the Andes, studies of Inca mummies suggested patterns of consanguinity consistent with chroniclers' reports. While no equivalent genetic work was done in Hawaii, where burials were treated with sacred care and generally not subject to excavation, oral and written genealogies provided their own record. These scientific and archival approaches gave indigenous movements additional support, showing that the old traditions were not myths but verifiable historical practices. The question of sibling unions also became part of broader conversations about kinship diversity worldwide. Anthropologists highlighted that many cultures had rules about cousin marriage, cross-cousin marriage, or other forms of unions that Europeans found unusual. By situating Hawaiian and Inca sibling unions within this global spectrum, scholars challenged the idea that there was only one natural way to organize family. This academic framing gave cultural activists further ground to argue that their ancestors' practices were legitimate cultural choices, even if they no longer applied in the present. In the political sphere, memory of sibling unions intersected with debates about sovereignty and identity. Hawaiian sovereignty movements invoked the sacred authority of aliʻi lines to argue for the continuity of Hawaiian nationhood. Although they did not emphasize sibling marriage itself, the genealogical logic that produced sacred rulers was part of the argument for why Hawaii remained distinct from the United States. In Peru, indigenous political leaders sometimes invoked Inca symbols, including the sacred royal couple, as emblems of resistance and resilience. In both contexts, the memory of sibling unions contributed indirectly to modern identity politics, reminding people that their cultures had once defined legitimacy and authority on their own terms. Outside these communities, global audiences consumed the memory of sibling unions in different ways. Travel writers, documentarians, and popular historians often highlighted the practice as a curiosity, a point of fascination to attract readers. In films, novels, and tourist performances, references to royal sibling marriage sometimes appeared, though usually stripped of their original sacred context. These representations risked turning the practice into spectacle, perpetuating exoticism rather than understanding. Yet even in distorted form, they kept the memory alive, ensuring that the story of sibling unions remained part of the cultural conversation. The extra layer of complexity came from within families themselves. Descendants of chiefly lines in Hawaii and noble families in the Andes sometimes carried pride in their ancestry but hesitated to discuss the details of sibling unions. In some cases, genealogical knowledge was guarded carefully, shared only within trusted circles. In others, families worked with historians to record their stories more openly, contributing to the preservation of cultural history. These private negotiations between silence and disclosure reveal how memory operated not only on the level of nations but also within households. Thus, in the modern era, the memory of sibling unions became multifaceted. It was part of academic research, cultural revival, political symbolism, popular representation, and family identity. No single version dominated. Instead, multiple layers coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. The practice itself was gone, but its echoes continued to shape how communities understood their past and defined themselves in the present. In the present day, sibling unions on islands like Hawaii and in former highland empires like that of the Inca no longer exist as living practices. Yet their legacy continues in ways that shape scholarship, cultural identity, and public memory. The subject occupies a peculiar space, neither forgotten nor revived, but studied, debated, and remembered as part of a larger story about how societies define kinship, legitimacy, and sacredness. In academic fields, sibling marriage among royals remains a subject of comparative anthropology and history. Courses on kinship regularly cite the Hawaiian piʻo unions alongside the Inca, ancient Egypt, and certain pharaonic dynasties. Scholars use these examples to demonstrate that incest taboos are not universal but vary according to cultural logic. Journals continue to publish studies analyzing why ruling elites in different parts of the world chose sibling marriage as a strategy, often emphasizing the link between divine legitimacy and concentrated power. The practice has thus moved from scandal into the realm of scholarly case study, treated as an important element in understanding human variation. In cultural preservation, chants, genealogies, and chronicles continue to be studied and taught. Hawaiian cultural practitioners work with recorded mele and oral traditions, teaching students that piʻo unions were once understood as sacred rather than sinful. In Peru, festivals and historical reenactments reference the royal couple, reminding audiences that the Inca emperor and his sister wife symbolized the sun and the moon. These forms of remembrance situate sibling unions within a narrative of cultural pride, reframing them as part of indigenous heritage rather than as moral failings. Museums and educational institutions also play a role. Exhibits on the Inca often highlight the importance of the emperor's marriage to his sister, contextualizing it within cosmology. Hawaiian exhibits present genealogical traditions, explaining how aliʻi families once maintained sacred rank. In both cases, the goal is not to sensationalize but to interpret, offering visitors an understanding of cultural logics different from their own. The presentation of these histories in museums reflects a broader effort to respect indigenous perspectives and to move away from the moral judgments of earlier colonial accounts. At the same time, the subject continues to generate unease. For many, the idea of siblings marrying remains deeply uncomfortable, shaped by modern laws and moral frameworks. This discomfort can color discussions, leading to hesitation in classrooms or in public discourse. Yet, the discomfort itself becomes part of the conversation, illustrating how cultural perspectives shape interpretation. The memory of sibling unions forces modern audiences to confront the relativity of social norms, reminding them that what is taboo in one context may be sacred in another. Indigenous voices are increasingly central in framing these conversations. Hawaiian scholars and cultural leaders emphasize that piʻo unions should be understood on their own terms, within the cosmological and political systems that gave them meaning. Andean scholars highlight the role of the Inca royal couple in embodying divine balance, cautioning against reducing their marriage to a sensational fact. By foregrounding indigenous perspectives, modern work seeks to restore dignity to traditions that were long condemned or misrepresented. Digital technology has further expanded the reach of these memories. Genealogical databases, digital archives of chants, and online museum exhibits allow wider audiences to access materials once confined to specialists. Students in Hawaii can listen to recordings of genealogical chants, while those in Peru can view digitized chronicles. This accessibility broadens awareness, though it also raises questions about context. Without careful framing, digital fragments can be misinterpreted, stripped of their sacred or cultural depth. The legacy of sibling unions also intersects with global conversations about kinship diversity. Anthropologists and sociologists point to Hawaiian and Inca practices as reminders that family is not a fixed structure but a cultural creation. In an era when debates about marriage, family, and identity continue worldwide, these historical examples offer a broader perspective. They show that human societies have always experimented with different ways of defining relationships, each with its own logic and consequences. For descendants of chiefly lines in Hawaii and noble lineages in the Andes, the memory remains personal as well as public. Some take pride in their ancestry, seeing the record of sibling unions as proof of their family's sacred status in the past. Others approach the subject cautiously, aware of the stigma that lingers. In either case, the knowledge shapes identity, linking individuals to a history that is at once unique and contested. Thus, in the present, sibling unions survive not as practices but as remembered institutions. They exist in chants, chronicles, museums, classrooms, and family stories. They are studied, debated, sometimes whispered about, sometimes celebrated. They remind us that human societies construct legitimacy and sacredness in different ways, and that what was once honored can later be condemned, then reinterpreted again. They endure as part of the larger human record, testimony to the diversity of ways people have understood kinship, power, and the sacred order of the world. And that brings us full circle, from the islands where bloodlines were guarded through sibling unions, to the empires where power was written into family itself, and finally to the world we know today, where those traditions live only in memory. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it shows us how far people will go to survive, to rule, and to believe. If this story gave you something to think about, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join me here on Eternal Obsidian, where the past is never forgotten and every tale leaves its mark. Until next time, stay curious and stay connected to the shadows of history.